Hello and welcome. So critical thinking is one of those skills that we all think we have. But unless we take the time to learn critical thinking and then take more time to put it into practice, can we really say that we're critical thinkers? For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike, and this video is part of a larger series called Philosophy 101. And the purpose of this series is to give you an introduction to philosophy that goes beyond just the ideas themselves. So the overall aim of this series is to give you that introduction to philosophy that actually enables you to engage actively in the act of philosophy. And over the last couple of videos, we have been looking at reason, we've been looking at logic, we've been looking at argumentation, and so on and so forth. And now we're going to wrap up that section with our video on critical thinking. So in the last video, we learned to identify some logical fallacies, which are common errors in reasoning. So today we're going to take a broader view and focus on critical thinking, which is an essential skill for evaluating evidence, avoiding biases, and making sound decisions. In an age of mass information, misinformation, and outright lies, critical thinking is more important than it's ever been. So the agenda for this video is, like all of them, is going to be fairly simple. So we're going to start by examining what exactly is critical thinking. And then once we've got our heads around the concept of critical thinking, we can then move on and look at some examples of common cognitive biases, a bit of a refresher on that one. And then from there, we can move on to start to think about how we evaluate evidence and sources. And finally, we'll do some practical exercises that will hopefully help to solidify your newfound knowledge and improve your critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is the process of analyzing and evaluating information to form well-reasoned judgments. It's about being curious, open-minded, and skeptical. Not accepting claims at face value, but also being willing to change your mind when presented with good evidence. So bear with me, I have some slides. So there we go. So critical thinking. There are some key components to critical thinking. We have clarity, relevance, logic, and evidence. So I could just leave it there, but I think it would be best to give some explanation of each of those key components and put some questions to you that will be examples of how you seek those things. So we're going to start with clarity. So clarity ensures that ideas, arguments, and statements are expressed in a way that's easily understood. Without clarity, it is difficult to evaluate the accuracy or relevance of the argument. Ambiguous or vague expressions can lead to misunderstandings and impede effective analysis. So on the slide, you can see a couple of pretty generic questions. And these are the sort of questions that you would ask in order to gain some clarity. So we've got, what do you mean by that? Could you elaborate or provide an example? And there are many more questions that would fit in here, but these are questions that we ask when we need more details, we need clarification. So imagine that someone says, we should implement stricter laws. What do you think a critical thinker might ask at this point? One thing a critical thinker might ask is, what specific laws are you referring to and in what context? So what this does is this helps to clarify the argument, which is obviously fairly obvious when I say it like that, but so that's clarity. It's something that actually most of us do in our sort of natural natural language and day-to-day communication. Somebody will come to us, they'll say something, it's fairly vague or ambiguous, so we have to gain some form of clarity. So we ask these questions. And next up we have relevance. So relevance focuses on whether the information or argument presented directly addresses the issue or question at hand. Irrelevant details or tangents can distract from the core issue and weaken the argument. So there's a couple of questions that you could ask at this point, and these are obviously super generic versions of questions. Each situation would bring forth its own set of more sort of specific and relevant questions, somewhat ironically. So we have, how does this point relate to the main issue, and is this information necessary to support the argument? So these are questions that we would ask in order to ascertain the relevance of the point being made to the main issue. So think about it in we've probably all seen or experienced debates about like or many things. So I'm just going to pick a random issue, climate change. So imagine a debate is going on about climate change policy, and in that debate someone brings up unrelated statistics about car accidents, which is obviously irrelevant. And at that point you'd ask questions like, how does this point relate to the main issue, like the questions on the screen? Is this information necessary to support the argument? And of course the answer to that second question is no, and the answer to the first question is that it doesn't relate to the main issue. So instead, our focus in that specific debate should be on data related to carbon emissions and environmental impact and things like that. So that's relevance in a nutshell, as it were. And next we have logic. So logic examines whether the reasoning is sound and whether the conclusions logically follow from the premises. Flawed reasoning, such as logical fallacies or inconsistencies, undermines the validity of an argument. So there are a couple of questions on the screen that are some examples of like generic questions that we could ask. So are there any gaps or contradictions in reasoning? Does the conclusion follow naturally from the evidence and premises? So let's think about an example. So a claim is made, all cats are mammals, and this animal is a mammal, so it must be a cat. This argument is obviously illogical because the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. The animal in question could be any mammal. There is no information in that claim that would actually help us to draw the conclusion that that animal is a cat. And the final key component of critical thinking is evidence. So evidence refers to the factual, reliable, and relevant data or support used to back a claim. Without credible evidence, arguments are based on assumptions or opinions, making them weak and unpersuasive. So there are some questions that we could ask at this point. And again, these questions are as generic as I could make them. So is the source of information reliable and unbiased? Or are there alternative explanations for the evidence? A claim that vaccines are unsafe, for example, should be supported by credible scientific studies and peer-reviewed research. Anecdotal evidence or unverified claims from social media would not be sufficient or reliable, therefore wouldn't be good evidence. So that's the evidence sort of component of critical thinking. So by addressing these components, critical thinking can be more rigorous and effective in evaluating arguments and solving problems. So imagine that you hear someone say something like, crime is increasing because the news reports more crimes. What questions would you ask to evaluate this claim? Before we continue, I want you to have a think about that and jump in the comments and try and answer. So that the kind of obviously pause the video and jump in the comments and answer that. And then when you come back, we can have a go at that together. Did you pause the video? Excellent. So let's let's have a think about it. So the claim is that crime is increasing because the news reports more crimes. So what questions would we ask to evaluate this claim? Well, there's a few things that come to mind. So we could ask a question like, what data supports the increase in crime? We could ask, are news reports reliable indicators of actual crime rates? And we could also ask, could other factors be influencing crime rates? And if you think about it for long enough, there is a multitude of questions you could ask at this point, but questions that like those that I've listed. So what data supports the increase in crime? Are news reports reliable indicators of actual crime rates? And could other factors be influencing crime rates? These are great questions that will help you to think critically about the claim. So let's move on to an activity. So this is something I want you to do in the comments as well. So what I want you to do is write down a recent claim you've heard and let us know what questions you think you could ask to critically evaluate that claim. It doesn't really matter at this point what the claim is or where it comes from and so on and so forth. What matters most is the questions that you come up with. So what questions could you ask to critically evaluate the claim that you've heard recently? So pause the video and do that, and then come back here and we can move on to part 2, where we will examine some examples of cognitive biases. So you're back. Excellent. Let's move on. So what are cognitive biases? Well, we've actually covered this already in a previous video. So if you haven't watched that, go and watch that. But in short, cognitive biases are systematic errors in thinking that affect how we process information. They often help us make quick decisions, but can lead to like flawed reasoning. So let's think about some examples of cognitive biases, and I've only got 4 examples for you because we have already done a video on this that you should go and check out. So consider this a refresher. So the first cognitive bias we're going to look at is confirmation bias, which is where we tend to seek out information that confirms our beliefs and at the same time we ignore evidence that contradicts them. I think we have all seen examples of this in our lives on a pretty much on a daily basis. So let's think about some examples of confirmation bias. So if someone believes a particular political party is corrupt, then that person might focus on scandals involving that party while ignoring similar issues in other parties. And let's face it, we've all seen that particular bias. We all live in the modern political world. So we've all seen that bias in action, where somebody supports one party and therefore makes an enemy of the other parties. So all the negative attention is focused on that other party, and they ignore the the negativity within their own. Another example of confirmation bias is a person that's convinced a home remedy works for a cold, and this person might overlook studies that show there's actually no scientific support for it, but nonetheless that person will believe the anecdotal evidence that's presented to them, and so on. So that's confirmation bias. Another example of confirmation bias is when we believe a stereotype, such as introverts are shy, and then we only notice examples that support this belief while dismissing contrary evidence. So that's the confirmation bias. I think we all have a good sense about what that is. We've all seen it and experienced it, and we've all done it as well. So I think generally we all have a pretty good sense of confirmation bias. So our next one is the availability heuristic, which is where we judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. So a great example of this is quicksand. So as a kid, certainly for my generation and the generations that came before, we all saw films where people would get stuck in quicksand and basically be swallowed up by the earth. And in those films, those old westerns and so on, it happened all the time, which gave us all the false impression that quicksand is, one, common, and two, dangerous. And as it turns out, it's not really either of those things. So the availability heuristic makes us believe that quicksand is a much more prevalent and dangerous problem than it actually is. Another example of the availability heuristic is so a friend of mine is a locksmith, and he sells, like home security stuff, cameras and that sort of thing, right? Home security systems. And whenever there's a burglary on the news, or word of it gets around town and whatnot, there is a massive increase in people that come to him for new locks and new security systems and so on. And that's because the report of the burglary makes it seem to people as if there is a dramatically increased risk of burglary in their area. And in reality, that's not the case. The sort of statistics remain fairly consistent, but nonetheless, that attention on the issue makes people believe that they are in immediate danger of being burgled. They overestimate the risk. So that's another example. And another example of the availability heuristic is when we see reports about rare but extremely dramatic diseases. And those reports make people worry more about those diseases than they do about the far more common but obviously less publicized ones that are actually a danger to them. So that's the availability heuristic. And our next sort of cognitive bias that we're going to look at is the bandwagon effect, which is where we are influenced by the beliefs or behaviors of others, often assuming that popularity equals validity or quality or whatever positive value that we want to put in there. So some examples of this are when people jump on a social media trend, such as like the whatever you call them, the TikTok dances and all of that sort of stuff. Because everyone else is doing it, people jump on it without really thinking about why they're doing it. In fact, they don't know why they're doing it. They're just jumping on it because it's the popular thing. And we also see examples of this in fashions. People start wearing a new style or whatever, because they've seen other people wearing it. They don't really understand anything about it, why that particular style has come into being, and so on and so forth. None of that. They just see the popularity of it and they jump in without really thinking about it. Another example of the bandwagon effect is supporting a sports team because most of your peers do, even if you've got no prior interest in the sport. So here in the UK, people are, or the general public are, mostly very keen on the sport of football, soccer if you're American. And if you asked a random British person what football team they support, the vast majority of people will name a team. But for some of those people, they have no actual interest in the sport. They probably don't even watch it or anything like that. But they will say, "Oh, I support this team." And that's just because that's what their peers do, their friends, their family, whatever. So that's the bandwagon effect in action. And we also see the bandwagon effect in play when there's like a fad diet going around, and these juice cleanses and other nonsense that doesn't actually do anything. So these fads come around and people jump on them. They don't really think about it. They just jump on it, and as a result, they haven't done any research to find out if there's any actual health benefits. And for most of these things, there's actually not. But nonetheless, that's the bandwagon effect in action. So let's now move on and think about the anchoring bias. So the anchoring bias is where we take the first piece of information that we hear as, like, to use some religious terminology, as gospel truth. So this is something we all do all of the time. The first thing you hear is always the correct thing in your mind in some sense, right? So in let's think of some examples. So in salary negotiations, if the employer suggests a low starting figure, then the employee might settle for less than they're worth. Or in any sort of negotiation, like you're haggling, you're buying I don't know, you're buying an antique or whatever, right? You're buying jewelry, whatever the thing is. And you've got a price that you're thinking about, that you're willing to pay. And the seller comes at you first and says, "Oh, it's X amount," but the figure you had in your head was half that. That's what you were willing to pay, half of that. But because this person has said, "No, it's this," and you haven't actually said your amount yet, in your mind there is a battle. Like, you can't go with yours because that's too far away from where they are, and where they are, that's the anchor that is in your mind at that moment. That's the correct price. Obviously you want to bring that down, such as the nature of haggling and negotiating, but that becomes the correct price. Now the problem with that is that the amount of money that you were willing to pay for it in the first place, which is half of what the seller has put out there as their price, is more than likely, the figure that you already had in your head is more than likely already the amount of value that you have assigned to that thing. So now you're paying potentially twice the price for something, even though from your perspective the amount that you had in your mind is a more than fair price. Another example of the anchoring bias is when estimating a city's population. This is something I've experienced in my own life. So when you hear an initial guess, that can strongly influence your final estimate, even if it's wrong. So in that example from my own life is that many years ago, many years ago, when I was at school, a teacher of mine, a geography teacher, told me that the Greater London area has a population of around 20 million people. And this number always sticks in my mind. So whenever it comes up in conversation, I always say, oh, about 20 million people. Um, Obviously, it's not something that comes up in conversation all that much, but it does occasionally. So I'll say, oh, yeah, about 20 million people. And I say that because that's the first number that comes to mind, because that moment, that when that teacher told me. However, there's a problem with that. And the problem is it's not true. The population of the Greater London area is in fact around 15 million. And all those years ago, when my teacher told me, it was much closer to 10 million. But nonetheless, whenever I'm asked, my first thought is always 20 million. And so that's the anchoring bias. It's something that we're all afflicted by all the time. So before we continue, I want you to think about, obviously pause the video for this and jump in the comments and let me know, but I want you to think about a time when one of these biases influenced your judgment. How can you avoid that from happening in the future? So jump in the comments and let me know. Obviously pause the video to do that, and then when you return, we will start thinking about how to evaluate evidence and sources. So, have you done that? Fantastic. So let's think about now how we evaluate evidence. So critical thinking, it requires evaluating the quality of evidence and the credibility of sources. Not all evidence is created equal, to say the least. So there is a bit of a checklist for whoops, I've gone too far. Bit of a checklist, just like with the critical thinking. So the checklist for evaluating evidence is relevance, credibility, accuracy, and context. So we will go through each one of those in turn and explore what each of those really means. So we will start with relevance. So evidence is only useful if it directly supports the claim being made. Irrelevant evidence can distract from the issue and weaken the argument. So in order to determine relevance, we must consider whether the evidence answers the central question or directly supports the argument. So there are some questions on the screen, and these are some pretty sort of generic questions. But these are some questions to ask. So does this evidence directly relate to the claim or the argument? And does it address the specific issue under discussion? So let's think about an example. So in a discussion about renewable energy's economic benefits, citing statistics about declining fossil fuel prices might be irrelevant unless it is somehow directly linked to renewable energy's comparative cost. So that's sort of how we think about evaluating evidence. Let's move on now to credibility. So the reliability, let me try that again. The reliability, that's better. The reliability of evidence depends on the trustworthiness of the source. Reliable sources are those with expertise, authority, and a history of accuracy. Before I continue, when I say authority, when somebody says, I'm the authority, They are never the authority. So the person who is the authority, they're not in charge. They're the person with the most information that's relevant and of high quality and so on. That's what we mean by authority. We don't mean the person in charge. So yeah, the reliable sources have to be those with expertise, authority, and a history of accuracy. Bias, whether intentional or unintentional, can and will distort evidence. So it's essential to identify whether the source has a vested interest in the outcome. So there are some questions that we could ask about to ascertain credibility. So is the source an expert or authority on the topic? Does the source have a history of reliability and accuracy? Could the source have a conflict of interest? So as an example, a study funded by a tobacco company claiming rather that smoking has minimal health risks is less credible due to the company's vested interests. In contrast, peer-reviewed research from independent institutions would be far more reliable. So that's credibility. So let's look now at accuracy. Evidence should be factually correct and backed up by verifiable data. Misinterpretations, outdated information, or errors undermine the validity of the evidence. It's crucial to cross-check claims against multiple reliable sources. So there are some questions that we would ask. Is the evidence backed by factual data or credible references? Is the information up to date and free from errors? As an example, a claim about the effectiveness of a new medication should be supported by results from clinical trials and scientific studies, not by anecdotal reports or outdated research. So let's think now about context. Is the evidence presented in a broader context, or is it cherry-picked? Evidence should be evaluated within its broader context. Cherry-picking data or taking evidence out of context can misrepresent the situation and lead to false conclusions. To avoid this, consider the entirety of the available information and whether opposing evidence has actually been acknowledged. Some questions we might ask are, is this evidence representative of the broader data set? Has the evidence been selectively presented to support a specific viewpoint? So let's think of an example. So highlighting a single month of low global temperatures to argue against climate change while ignoring long-term warming trends is an example of cherry-picking evidence, and we've all seen that. You've only got to log on to social media for a moment to see exactly that that problem in action. So this checklist that we've worked through for assessing evidence, it is let me try that again. So this checklist we've worked through to assess evidence ensures that the evidence is robust, relevant, and reliable, enabling well-informed decision-making and argumentation. So let's move on now to misinformation, because that's something that is very relevant to the world in which we live. So misinformation is, oh, I've gone too far. It's a very common thing. And in the age of mass communication and social media and real time news reports and so on and so forth, misinformation spreads like wildfire. So, as critical thinkers, it's important that we are critical of sources. In fact, it's more than important, it's essential. It is yeah, we can't not do it, otherwise we're going to end up in trouble. So there are some and I hate this term red flags, but I couldn't think of a better one when I put the slides together. So there are there are some sort of red flags, some things to look out for regarding misinformation. So the first of those is emotional language or sensationalism. Next is lack of citations or references, and the third is over reliance on anecdotal information, evidence rather. And we're going to look at those, each of those individually. Some emotional language or sensationalism. We've all seen it in headlines and social media posts and so on. So misinformation often uses emotionally charged language or sensational headlines to grab attention and provoke a strong reaction. This approach can bypass critical thinking, encouraging people to respond emotionally rather than rationally. Sensationalism exaggerates or distorts facts to make them more dramatic or alarming, often prioritizing shock value over accuracy. So, why is this actually a problem? Well, emotional appeals can manipulate audiences into accepting claims without scrutinizing the underlying evidence. We are emotional beings, so we are heavily influenced by the emotions that are sort of pushed onto us and presented to us. So there are some questions we could ask. Does this information seem designed to provoke an emotional reaction rather than inform? And are the claims exaggerated or lacking nuance? So let's think about some examples. So a headline says this one weird trick will cure cancer. This headline is quite clearly sensationalized and oversimplified. Another example is an article describing routine policy decisions as devastating or the end of freedom or the end of democracy without any factual support to or anything like that. And the aim of this really is to inflame emotions rather than inform. Let's think of another example. So there's a post, you see a post declaring urgent, your family is in danger unless you share this now. You see this post on social media. And what does this post tell you, really? It tells you that the post is designed to create panic without any substance. It has no substantive evidence whatsoever. In fact, it doesn't even tell you why you're in danger or why it's urgent that you share it now and so on and so forth. So it's a purely emotional claim. It's designed to get you panicking and not thinking. So let's move on now to, oh, I've gone too far. Lack of citations or references. And we see this all the time too. Credible information is usually backed by sources, citations, or references to verifiable data or research. Misinformation often lacks these or references vague, unverifiable so-called studies or experts. When claims are made without evidence, it becomes impossible to assess their accuracy or credibility. So why is this a problem? Well, without proper references, there's no way to confirm whether information is accurate or fabricated. So at this point, we could ask ourselves some questions. Does the content include specific citations or links to reputable sources? Can I verify the claim from independent and credible sources? So let's think about some examples. So Our first example is a social media post claiming experts say drinking coffee reduces your risk of heart disease. But that post doesn't in any way, shape, or form name the experts or provide a study reference. Let's face it, we have all seen posts like that on social media. Another example is articles making bold claims such as science proves X, but failing to include any scientific studies or data to actually support the statement. And our final example, before we move on to anecdotal evidence, is a viral infographic with statistics but no source attribution, which leaves the numbers, the statistics, leaves them unverifiable, and therefore kind of pointless and irrelevant. So those are some examples of lack of citations or references. So let's move on now. So anecdotal evidence refers to personal stories or isolated examples that are used to support a claim. While personal experiences might be compelling, they are not a substitute for systematic scientific evidence. Misinformation often relies heavily on anecdotes because they are emotionally resonant and harder to disprove on an individual level. So why is this actually a problem? Well, anecdotes are non-representative and can lead to overgeneralizations. They ignore broader data trends or research findings that might contradict the personal story. So let's think about some questions. So is this claim based on a single example or a larger, well-researched body of evidence? Are there any studies or data to support this anecdote? So those are some good questions that we could ask when faced with sort of anecdotal evidence. So let's think about some examples. So a person claiming my grandmother smoked every day and lived to 100, so smoking isn't harmful, ignores the broader evidence linking smoking to health risks, and it also ignores other contributing factors to the long life of the grandmother. Another example is testimonials about a miracle weight loss product without clinical trials or scientific validation. And these testimonials are, at best, anecdotal and not all reliable forms of evidence. Another example is a claim that I personally know someone who recovered from the flu using this herbal remedy. This claim lacks scientific support and doesn't account for broader data and therefore is meaningless. So by identifying these red flags, you can more effectively question and evaluate the credibility of the information you encounter. So on the screen before you is a claim that I want you to consider, and that claim is that vaccines cause autism. So how would you evaluate the evidence for or against this claim? So have a think about it, pause the video, and in the comments, I want you to put your answer, and then when you come back, we will go through it together. So, did you do it? Brilliant. So, how would we evaluate the evidence for or against this claim? Well, there's a few things that we could do, right? We could look at peer-reviewed studies. We could evaluate the credibility of the sources, and we could check for scientific consensus. So those are some ways that we could evaluate the evidence for or against this claim. And if you're wondering at all, the evidence would suggest that this claim is false, that vaccines in fact don't cause autism. However, don't take my word for it. Go and find out. So that is, that's how we evaluate evidence and sources. We ask these questions. We look for peer-reviewed studies. We evaluate credibility of sources, and we check for scientific consensus, and so on and so forth. So now let's move on to some exercises. Our first exercise is a fact-checking exercise. So the claim is that eating carrots significantly improves your eyesight. Is this claim true? So I want you to pause the video and jump in the comments and answer that. So identify some reliable sources and evaluate the claim. And when you unpause the video, we can discuss it and go through it together. So, did you do it? Excellent. So let's go through it together. So what did you find? Does this claim that eating carrots significantly improves your eyesight, does it hold up to scrutiny? Well, when I looked into this, I found studies and so on that suggest that carrots contain vitamin A, which actually does support eye health. However, they don't significantly improve eyesight in any measurable way. So the claim is false. Basically, it does not hold up to. It does not hold up under scrutiny. So eating carrots does not significantly improve your eyesight. So let's move on now to another example that we can work through. Oh, I've gone back. Gone too far. Keep doing that. So here's an argument, as you can see on the screen. This time we're doing argument analysis. So premise 1 is that crime rates are increasing. Premise 2 is increased crime is due to violent video games. And the conclusion is we should ban video games to reduce crime. So, what questions would you ask to evaluate this argument? Are the premises supported by evidence? Is the conclusion justified? So pause the video and have a think about that, and then when you come back, we will discuss it. So, did you do it? Excellent. So, let's think about this argument. So, crime rates are increasing. Increased crime is due to violent video games. Therefore, we should ban violent video games to reduce crime. Now, if we check the crime data and we look for studies linking video games to violence, and we also consider other factors influencing crime, it becomes fairly clear that there is no causal connection between an increase in crime and the playing of video games. So the in this particular example, the argument is basically not a good one. It's not true. There is no causal connection between violent video games and an increase in crime rates. And as I say, we get that information from checking the crime data, looking at the variety of studies that link video games to violence, and obviously we have to consider other factors influencing crime. So what do I mean by other factors influencing crime? Well, there are many things that influence crime. There are internal things like a person's own mental health, their personality, and so on. But there's also external factors like poverty and so on and so forth. And if you live in a high crime area, you are statistically speaking more likely to engage in crime and so on and so forth, right? So there's all these other factors that influence it, and as it turns out, violent video games just aren't one of them. So that's that exercise done, and let's move on. So critical thinking, and we're going to wrap up now because I think I've kept you for nearly an hour at this point, and I don't want to keep you forever. So so let's wrap it up. So critical thinking is a skill that requires practice. You can navigate complex information and make better decisions by recognizing biases, evaluating evidence, and asking the right questions. So what I want you to do as we part ways is to write a short paragraph answering the question on the screen, which is, what steps will you take to improve your critical thinking skills in everyday life? So post that in the comments, and I very much look forward to reading those responses. So this basically concludes our module, if you will, on logic and critical thinking. So in the next group of videos, the next module, we're going to shift gears to the philosophy of religion. Exciting stuff. And in that, we're going to explore arguments for and against the existence of God, or a God of some kind. So I hope to see you there. And before I go, though, I would like to ask if you could do all the YouTube things, like the videos, subscribe to the channel, and all that good stuff. Obviously, that benefits me, and I genuinely appreciate it. But also, it lets YouTube know that you're interested in philosophy. You're not just interested in me and what I've got to say. You're interested in the subject. So YouTube will then start to show you other creators and other thinkers that will be talking about similar things, which in turn means that you are able to widen your perspective, grow your knowledge, and not be sort of pinned down by any one particular interpretation. The greater access to that knowledge will enable you to think critically about it and draw your own conclusions. So there is definite benefit in liking the video and subscribing to the channel for you. So that's it for today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one, where we start our journey into the philosophy of religion. Thank you very much, and I'll see you there.